Welcome everyone to the Edmonton Roundtable. This was already a crisis, intersectional impact of COVID-19 and GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. So on April 30th, the Building Leadership Capacity to Address Gender-Based Violence Against Non-Status Refugee and Immigrant Women Across Canada project, we introduced the virtual roundtable series to host conversations and exchanges that consider the differential impact of COVID-19 for non-status refugee and immigrant women. This roundtable series is an opportunity to share strategies and practices and work out ideas through conversation. As we've expressed at our other roundtables, the idea here is not about leading, but instead leveraging and hosting these conversations at a national level. We adopt a social justice approach that suggests that a more comprehensive analysis and collective discussion of social problems can yield more effective social action, advocacy, strategies, and responses. We want to start by thanking everyone for joining us today. We're heartened by the number of people who've registered across Canada to participate in the regional roundtables. My name is Margarita Pinton-Perez, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence at Advocacy, the Ontario Council for Agencies Serving Immigrants. Joining me today as co-hosts of this conversation are Nira Elgueta, Project Coordinator for the GBV Building Leadership Capacity Project, Maytal Siva from Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, and Nahid Amja Minhas from Islamic Family and Social Services Association.
Hello, I am Nahid Amjad Minhas from Islamic Family and Social Services Association. And my colleague, Maytal Siva Jain from Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton are the regional partners on the Building Leadership Capacity project mentioned by Margarita. Today's roundtable is focused on Edmonton. We want to reflect and discuss the advocacy and survivor-led work by and for non-status refugee and immigrant women taking place in the Edmonton area. As the regional partners, we are going to moderate the discussion with speakers from the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association, Indo-Canadian Women's Association, and Multicultural Health Brokers. And we have a special speaker, Monica, who will join us in the last part of the roundtable as well.
I'm going to read the land acknowledgement now. We respectfully acknowledge the autonomy of Indigenous people and that Edmonton, where we're holding the roundtable, is located on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Region 4 territory. Amisquachi, a traditional home and gathering place for many Indigenous people, including Blackfoot, Niitsitapi, Cree, Nehiawak, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, Métis, and specifically the ancestral space of the Papas Chase Cree. It is important for us from the outset to express our solidarity with Indigenous community across Turtle Island who continue to experience colonial violence, including intersectional gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. My workplace, the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, we exist to support people impacted by sexual violence and engage communities to promote respect and uphold a culture of consent. We cannot achieve this goal without first recognizing how non-consensual and violent displacement of Indigenous people across this land directly connect to issues of sexual violence. SACE is committed to making every effort to be considered a safe and useful tool in the healing journey of Indigenous people. To do so, we must first recognize and honor our collective responsibility towards reconciliation and decolonization, a process that must center Indigenous voices and self-advocacy work. It has been a year since the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It is important to reflect on what it means to do this work and host this conversation in this context of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We'll also draw the critical race scholar we also draw from critical race scholars in Canada who have recognized the importance of addressing colonial violence as a first step in healing across communities. We take seriously the notion that Shirin Vazak emphasized in 2014, which is that we can move into recognizing the humanity of refugee, immigrant, and other people if our day-to-day life is intensely structured by the inhumanity with which we have treated Indigenous people.
Thank you, Nahid, and thank you, Maytal. Before we start, I just know Nira has a few points in terms of the meeting today and encouraging you to maybe stay in speaker view. So if Nira, you want to take over, just kind of give some of the.
Hello. So today we will be covering a lot of information, a copy of the slides and recording the presentation we will share with you later. If at any point you need to pause, please take a break and check with yourself or your colleague. And sorry, we also want you to, sorry, just one second, I'm losing my information here. And remember that you can post any questions in the chat at any point of the presentation, and we will take some time at the end to respond to those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Nira. And so to start with the chat, we encourage you to share your location and the organization, networks, or communities you're joining us from. All right, so before we begin, I'm just going to share a little bit briefly about who we are. This project is called Building Leadership Capacity to Address Gender-Based Violence Against Non-Status Refugee and Immigrant Women Across Canada. We're a growing network of service providers, organizational leaders, community advocates, and academic researchers working together on building leadership capacity and focusing on collective ways of advocacy and building networks across Canada. This is a 5-year project, and it's funded by Women and Gender Equality as part of their GBV strategy, Canada's strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. We have partners across 5 different regions in Canada: Edmonton, Fredericton, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver. And as the project develops, the idea is that the networks will continue to grow. So this today is a part of us launching that invitation, welcoming people to join our national network that's growing, and also to be a part of our peer champion network. Nira is going to take over. She's just going to review the objectives and the agenda, and then we're going to briefly discuss a little bit more about this project.
Yes, thank you, Margarita. So the objectives for today's meetings are to learn about the project, the research, and our blueprint in progress, to learn from our speakers, our community members, organizational leaders, and advocates, reflecting on how to do community advocacy work to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women, specifically in Edmonton and Alberta, and the challenges of advocacy work and the importance of this work right now, especially in the context of COVID-19. At the end, as Margarita mentioned it, we also will share with you some ways to get involved and participate in our project and build and the building of our blueprint. As I mentioned before, I think Margarita is sharing the agenda with you. We have a very packed agenda, but we will share a copy of the presentation later on with you. If at one point you need to pause again, take a break, please do check with your colleague or yourself. And the chat is there for you. If you have any questions, if you have any issues or anything pressing, please write it on the chat box. Yeah, back to you, Margarita.
Great, thank you, Nira. So just to start, we just want to briefly give you a little bit of background for our project, the Building Leadership Capacity to Address Gender-Based Violence Against Non-Status Refugee and Immigrant Women Across Canada. This is a project that really comes out of decades of community-based advocacy work that's modeled after the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network here in Toronto, and initiatives based in capacity building towards survivor-centered initiatives by and for non-status refugee and immigrant women in the immigrant and refugee serving sector, which is modeled after OCASI's Peer Champions campaign. So the idea for this project is that we combine these 2 promising practices, which are already well underway in Toronto. And both of these practices, the objective is to focus on building leadership capacity of communities, organizations, leaders, advocates, and non-status refugee and immigrant women to prevent and respond to GBV through leadership, collective advocacy, education, and networking. So this might sound a little bit abstract, a little bit, you might be having questions like, what do we mean by peer champions? What do we mean by the community advocacy networks? We do invite you to check out some of our previous roundtables focused on really sharing more details about this project, and also the research component of the project that we're only going to briefly be able to discuss right now before we go into the roundtable discussion. But we do welcome you to check out the Advocacy GBV website, where we have all of the recordings and further information about the project. And we would be happy to answer any questions, so people can reach out to us as well. So to start thinking about those two promising practices, they are modeled, as I mentioned, after two practices that are already underway in Toronto. So the first one, this idea of a community advocacy network, it's modeled after the Rights of Non-Status Women Network. I'm not sure if folks have heard about this network here in Toronto, but it's a grassroots network of service providers and activists who've been gathering for nearly 14 years now to work together to strategize around how to best support women with precarious immigration status and deal with the multiple forms of violence in their lives. What's unique about the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network is it uses a community-based model to be more responsive to gaps and supports for NSRI women, which is non-status refugee and immigrant women. And they develop kind of a shared analysis of policies that are affecting NSRI communities. Each year, what the network does is it hosts educational forums for service providers on issues around housing, mental health, sanctuary city policies, immigration law, and policy for NSRI women and their families. The network really uses a grassroots approach around advocacy building and capacity for developing a diversity of solutions that are not constrained by service user models. So there will be, for example, participants at training forums that will share kind of creative ways and concrete strategies that they've used to help NSRI survivors navigate access to healing and support. And a frequent benefit is that this kind of informal way of networking actually fosters a way of being connected to different organizations, different perspectives, different community leaders. So it becomes a real beneficial way of creating a more creative case management for building mutual support, as well as really developing a shared analysis across various silos that exist in the NGO sector. So we did hear from the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network at our roundtable on July 30th. We welcome you to check out the recording. I know that Nsri will be able to share the link right now so that you can check out their website, the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network website, and you can see some of the work and the campaign work that they've done. Nsri, I'll let you take over so you can speak more to the peer champions component of our project.
Thank you, Margarita. So the peer champion model, as Margarita mentioned, the goal of the IRC-NFF campaign, so immigrant, refugees, communities, neighbors, friends, and families, is to build community-based responses to address gender-based violence among immigrants and refugee communities. The campaign creates strong connections with community leaders who have a deep and trust ties with immigrants, refugees, and organizations serving those individuals in their communities. The peer champions are trained and support to identify and support newcomer women experiencing violence and to educate their communities about the effects of violence against women among immigrant and refugee communities. Some of the activities that the peer champion develop and create through the year are, for example, they do every year, as I mentioned before, we have a cohort between 15 and 20 peer champions that trained and selected across Ontario. They have the freedom to create and deliver their community and educational events in whatever form or way that fits their needs and the needs of their community. Peer champions deliver community events in spaces, student unions, neighborhood groups, in the workplace, or in what we have identified as entry points, language schools, food banks, or drop-in centers. There's, in the slide that you have there, you can see some of the events created by the last cohort of peer champions. So the first one was an event with the Sri Lankan youth community in the east side of Toronto. as an event to celebrate International Women's Day with the Latin American community in Hamilton, and a holiday party for the youth of the Thorncliffe Park area in Toronto. Margarita?
Great, thank you, Nira. So very briefly, because I know we are conscious of the time and we want to get to our roundtable speakers, but very briefly, we're just going to share a little bit about what we did in our research. So it really, in designing this project, one of our primary objectives was to test kind of our assumptions. So not only the assumptions that we had coming out of existing scholarship, but also the assumptions that we had in terms of how about doing grassroots community work, advocacy work, peer champion, survivor-led work in Toronto and Ontario. And also thinking about that sometimes these terms are as popular as they are confusing, you know, when we're thinking about advocacy, when we're thinking about building capacity or leadership. So it's important to really help us think about what these terms mean and why we're using them. We set out to learn more about the local realities in the different regions where we were going to be implementing this project, which is Ottawa, Vancouver, Edmonton, Fredericton, and Toronto. So questions we had were like, how does advocacy, what are practices of advocacy? What are advocacy strategies that are developing in Toronto, and do they align or not align, for example, with what we're hearing and what's happening in other regions? How might we adjust our approach to build and support what currently exists? At the same time, this was an opportunity to meet and build relationships. So we're working in Toronto, but we're thinking about a project being national, being across Canada. So it was an opportunity for us to also meet and learn about the great work that's happening across different regions. And what you're seeing right here is just a sneak peek of the cover of our research report titled Our Research Journey. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very briefly share with you part of what the research did was an environmental scan and a needs assessment. The environmental scan, it included a consultation with over 76 service providers and community advocates in the regions where our project is taking place. So that's in Fredericton, Ottawa, Toronto, Edmonton, and Vancouver. And we were asking questions about existing supports and services in the region for non-status refugee and immigrant women. In fact, today during the roundtable discussion, I know we have speakers from the Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op, where we actually hosted our consultation in 2019. Nira, do you want to take over and just share a little bit over the needs assessment?
Absolutely. Thank you, Margarita. So for the needs assessment, we conducted focus group and interviews with 49 non-status refugee and immigrant women whom we recruit through our partner organizations and the stakeholders whom we consulted. We use a participatory, community-based, and trauma-informed approach in designing the focus groups. For example, we pilot our questions with a group of non-status refugee and immigrant survivors who provided critical feedback. We also created a webinar for our community partners on how to conduct participatory research with Nsri women so that we weren't just doing research, but teaching the frontline workers of those organizations how to do research. Margarita?
Thank you, Nira. So where are we at? We completed this research in 2019, and we've organized and analyzed the data, and that's shaping what is called the blueprint. So what is a blueprint? The blueprint is really language that's coming out of the funder, and also with this emphasis around research and developing programs that can be evaluated. So what is a blueprint? A blueprint is really defined as a practical kind of how-to resource that provides an outline of what our promising practices are and shows ways in which they can be replicated, adopted by other organizations, and adapted to local contexts. So as a recap right now, we've completed the research. You know, we're developing now this blueprint around the peer champion model, seeing it as a model that can be implemented in other communities. And it's a 5-year project. So right now we're just in the stages of implementing this and bringing it to life in the regions that are a part of our study. So just really quickly, because here there's not enough time to go over all of the richness of the data and everything that we heard. But in terms of in the stakeholder consultations, we really learned the importance of advocacy work that is happening across the different regions, and the really unique position that service providers are at to engage in kind of public policy advocacy and to raise awareness around issues related to GBV, and in particular, gender-based violence at this intersection with immigration status. What you'll notice is that, I just want to make sure I have the right one, the slide up, yeah. What we really notice is the importance of seeing all these different ways that advocacy takes shape and happens through different channels. So it could be happening in softer ways. You know, groups are engaging, for example, in planning tables, national councils, working groups, committees, boards, umbrella groups. And what we thought was helpful was to really kind of shape this typology of advocacy and speak to the different forms that we were able to observe. So ranging from more formalized networks, for example, cross-sectoral kind of collaborations, advocacy campaigns, informal programs and support services, community gatherings as well, that might be organized by grassroots or civic or faith-based groups. And then more, you know, highly informal networks, which could be maybe neighborhood get-together, it's organized by residents. So these groups are gathering more informally at the neighborhood or at a local kind of level. But what's really important is in all of those spaces, there's these connectors. So folks who are out there helping people on the ground, connecting them to different services and supports in their local communities. So at the same time, you know, we're hearing all of the amazing work that's happening, the different kinds of different forms of advocacy work, and we're also hearing something that was kind of shared, were the shared challenges across the different regions. So we're hearing, you know, about an advocacy chill, about navigating multiple systems, this issue of capacity, which we know we hear a lot in our sectors, work that's being completed off the side of the desk. So, you know, in terms of the advocacy chill, we're hearing from groups that there's this fear of losing funding, of being muted, of being silenced. And this term advocacy can sometimes be quite radioactive. It can mean certain things that feel like they don't fit within people's mandates, yet at the same time are being done at the everyday. And we're also really realizing that advocacy work, it looks different. If you're a service provider, if you're a community organizer, if you're an organizational leader. We're learning about the way that service providers are also navigating multiple systems. So, you know, there's different systems that service providers work within: the immigration system, housing, healthcare system, child welfare system, so many things to think about. And when they're thinking about the needs of non-status refugee and immigrant women, they are doing so in a very holistic and intersectional way. That means people's needs are intersectional. That means they're intersecting with multiple systems and navigating multiple systems. And then in terms of capacity, the issue there is, you know, what about this idea of this work happening off the side of my desk? So what happens when people are navigating all of these systems, when we're thinking about the advocacy chill, and we think about, you know, the issues there that are for people that have very high case loads, there's high turnover. So off the side of my desk means that sometimes there's, in addition to all of the immediate needs that they're serving, they're also trying to challenge some of these bigger systemic barriers and issues. So for our project, what we wonder is, well, what happens when we navigate these systems not in isolation or carried out only by individuals in each of the organizations, but what if we were doing this work collaboratively? What if we were working together with each other, redistributing some of this work? So this is where this idea of our blueprint, remember the resource, the kind of the toolkit that is informed by the research in these conversations. So the idea of like, what would it look like if we had further capacity and support doing this in a way that's collective, to navigate collectively some of these systemic barriers to doing the work? What happens when we no longer carry this work out in isolation? So thinking about redistributing the work as well. And the idea that leadership and capacity for this type of work can come not only from an organization, but we're thinking about the community, the non-BAW sector, outside of the immigrant and refugee serving sector, right? So we're thinking about building leadership capacity also among non-status refugee and immigrant women, community leaders, community advocates. The objective ultimately is really to create a network that aims to provide a voice for and by NSRI women through advocacy, through education, through furthering capacity building and networking. Neera, do you want to take over and just go, you can go over through the needs assessment piece?
Yes, so as Margarita mentioned, we set on a journey to hear from non-status refugee and immigrant women and to hear from their impressions of the terms safety, healing, and leadership that are central to our project, and what it means to be a survivor. Were they comfortable with the mainstream definitions? More significantly, what are their own definitions? And how did their experiences and perspective challenge our assumptions about what a survival-led project might look like? So non-status refugee and immigrant women challenged the assumptions of survivor, migrant women, leader, and they also introduce us to the ideas of community forms of healing and promoting safety. They talk about promoting neutral places to access services and creating safe spaces to build community. Our blueprint also mentioned that. So for us, what does it mean to create a blueprint for the peer champions? For us, it means that at a national level, blueprint that is inclusive of non-status of refugee women. What does it mean for us when we are supporting and engaging with peer champions? We reimagine leadership, survivorship as a process to build community-based safety and make a space for holistic healing, support, sports, drop-ins, and joy. It also includes having non-status refugee and immigrant women having a central part of the creation and delivery of the programs, avoiding framing survivorship as a one-time event and a static event or label. Instead, it considers how surviving is an ongoing process, not limited to one source of oppression. It challenges ideas about safety and healing as only individuals. What about collective healing, collective safety, and collective healing from structural harm? What about including spaces where non-status refugee and immigrant women are already participating? How do we include those spaces into our project? And it includes creating a capacity for healing outside of the survival label. Are there any neutral spaces where humanity can be restored, spaces of joy, community, and shared healing?
Thank you, Nira. And what folks are seeing on the screen is a visual summary of our roundtable where we shared the research findings. So again, we welcome you to check out the website where you can find the recording, you can find a written summary, and also view this visual summary and share it with others. So thank you, Nira. We don't want to take up too much time with the project overview. We want to just jump in now to our roundtable. So next, we want to welcome all of our speakers, Maytal, Nahid, our moderators, to join us again. And if you'd like to turn your cameras on. Wonderful. So we're going to start now the roundtable discussion. And in this discussion, all of our speakers are first going to be invited to just speak about kind of community-based advocacy practices and survivor-led work that is underway in the region. And then they're going to have an opportunity to speak to some of those unique challenges and tensions that impact doing this kind of work. And we're going to have one question as well that's focused and grounded in thinking around COVID-19. So allowing us to kind of think about the importance of advocacy work, survivor-led work during this critical time. So without further ado, I'm going to let Nahid and Maytal take over so they can introduce our speakers and we can start with the roundtable.
Thank you, Margarita. I'm going to start off by introducing the speakers, and I'll ask that they kindly join us back on video. I would like to first introduce Rekha Gadia. She holds a Master of Arts degree from India and Masters of Business Administration from Nova Southeastern University in Florida. Rekha has been working as the Family Services Department Manager at the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association for over 11 years. She is passionate about her work in the human services sector, particularly in the area of domestic violence prevention and removing settlement barriers for newcomer women. Rekha also has over 18 years of volunteer experience in the nonprofit sector and holds great pride for being able to give back to the community through supporting immigrant women and their families facing settlement experiences. Then I would like to introduce Amrita Mishra. She is Project Director with the Indo-Canadian Women's Association. She is an expert in community-based participatory action research, building service capacity for anti-violence work. Advocate for gender equity and social justice, author, artist, and athlete. Amrita is currently lead of an Alberta-wide multi-agency project on home visitation as a support against family violence funded by WAGE. Prior to 2020, she has similarly designed and implemented federally funded projects related to the prevention of senior abuse and complex forms of misogynistic violence. Then I would like to introduce Joy Midori. She is a registered provisional psychologist with the Multicultural Health Brokers Cooperative. Joy provides counseling services to families with newcomer and/or refugee status, as well as case consultation. Additionally, she assists in the development and implementation of MCHB's Early Childhood Development Program as the clinical and program development lead. She aims to place her work within the context of the lived realities of the families and individuals. She serves and endeavors to work as an intercultural partner with deep respect and gratitude for the diverse ways of knowing and healing that are inherent and underlie the legacies of all communities. Then I would introduce Tigis Defla. She's born in Ethiopia to Eritrean parents. Tigis came to Canada in the early 1980s. She soon became involved in supporting refugees and immigrant families with a strong focus on health, parenting, and family well-being. She has been working with families, government, and police to develop effective ways to support newcomer families impacted by family conflict and violence. As a women natural leader within her community, Tigist has illustrated the pathway for women and men to work together in mutually honoring relationships despite a long history of gender power differential. On a daily basis, Tigis works at Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op, supporting most vulnerable families impacted by family violence and involved in child welfare. With holistic attentiveness, engaging multiple stakeholders, including conducting training in developing and implementing support that leads to the safety and well-being of all family members. So.
Great, thank you, Naqib. Thank you for introducing all the speakers, and nice to meet everyone on the video call. So to start, we want to invite Rekha, and I saw Rekha's video there, so I just want to pull her up there. Hi, Rekha.
Hi.
Wonderful. So Rekha, we're delighted to have you participate in our conversation today, and we think you're in such a unique position to really observe and maybe speak to the history of advocacy work and the ways in which, in addressing GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women and communities has evolved over the years. So we just wanted to give you an opportunity to open up the roundtable and share a few words on that.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thanks to Kasi and this group for organizing this roundtable to bring much needed attention to the issues of GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada and the intersectional impact of that with the COVID-19. I would like to open up the discussion by speaking to the history of advocacy work, as Margarita mentioned, and the developing of programming for and by immigrant women in Calgary, Alberta. In my decade-long experience working at Calgary Immigrant Women's Association, which I will refer as CIVA, I feel that both CIVA and the Calgary domestic violence sector has been really championing the advocacy work towards eradicating the GBV, and then both as an agency and also as a sector. And here is some context why I say this. So first, I'll speak from the agency standpoint. So having a mandate to empower immigrant women and their families, we have been serving, women dealing with domestic violence and abuse, providing both prevention and intervention supports. And while doing that, we realized that despite facing serious abuse and violence, many immigrant women were choosing to go back to their abusive spouses because of their kids. And after doing all of this, this led us to really have a shift in our service approach and thought process approach. So we came to realization that empowering only the women is really actually widening the gap. So we have to really engage the men in the process, because at the end of the day, that's what the goal is, to have the families together for many of these immigrant women, right? So in that process, when we started engaging these spouses as well, we realized that we cannot write off the perpetrators. That was a huge learning, rather than we should be engaging them in the process, right, to really eradicate the GBV. In talking to many of the spouses we served, one thing we realized that no one really starts off in their life, especially when they come to a new country, as with a goal to become an abuser. The various stress factors of integration that leads to family conflict, malparenting practices, and eventually to violence, right? So we learned that a lot of it, this GBV is also situational violence. So there are two types of, as we all know, the situational and the coercive, but a lot of the immigrant families were because of the situational violence. So, and then there is the violence that comes with the coercive control. We also have now started to look into deconstructing that. And this is also coming from the deep-rooted patriarchy. We recognize that, they may have people may have early childhood experiences, both victims and perpetrators, and that is also playing a huge role in the coercive control where they come from, right? And we recognize now that the newcomers and refugees are not softwares and cannot be simply downloaded with a message, "Congratulations, you are now Canadian." We are all hardwares instead of, instead with the defined gender norms, roles, behaviors. And in order to truly resolve the issue of GBV, we need to deconstruct these healthy gender norms for ourselves, the service providers, as a sector, and to educate our clients. Otherwise, we'll keep reacting instead of resolving the GBV issues. And this was all very beautifully supported in Calgary by our involvement in the domestic violence sector here, and now in Alberta through the Impact, both CDBC and the Impact. They focus heavily on a collective impact model and a joint coordinated response system, both to service and to advocacy. And this plays a huge role when it comes to really making shifts, moving the needle in the sector and in the province, now in the nation. So to ensure that the ethnocultural communities have a voice, CDBC also now has ECDC as one of the three leverage areas, and ECDC is the Ethnocultural Domestic Violence Collective. So, and they also have another two areas like the Coordinated Service Response and then Engaging Men and Voice. Impact is doing similar things provincially. So our intersectional approach through the service delivery, advocacy, and education as an agency has really been through offering a lot of educational workshops for mainstream organizations, including health, social services, law enforcement, all these historical things that I've shared in the previous context is really driving this approach now. So we also kind of came up with the gender violence curriculum, prevention curriculum that we now started offering in 2 to 3 Calgary Board of Education schools each year. And that aims to really promote the healthy relationships and start, as I said, deconstructing these healthy gender norms, both starting early on with the youth and then taking the parents to that journey as well, walking through the journey. And then participating in many of the committees, as I mentioned, the interagency meetings that are really focused on the domestic violence issues. And then one of the major things we have done is being involved with the Calgary Police System's Equally Safe Domestic Conflict Response Team, which is the DCRT 2.0 model, which is a very unique model in Canada. The Calgary is very first in that sense that they have a community-based model of dealing with the domestic violence issues with the police directly. So we're a part of that core team that connects immigrant families with the required intervention and prevention support from the time they get involved with the police. So 2 of our family counselors and 1 of our case managers are working hand in hand with the Calgary Police Services to really provide that lens, culturally sensitive lens, and to the GBV issues. And then also simultaneously working on some of the research projects. So we have our own in-house research project that we are working on, Employment Security Alliance for Immigrant Women, that aims to really help identify the systemic barriers that prevent women from fleeing domestic violence and from entering and remaining in the workplace, and ensures that they have the community and economic supports to help them in breaking free through the cycle of violence, and also creating institutional change, which is very much in line with the advocacy work that we're talking about, and in increasing the economic security of those women facing abuse. And there are multiple other research projects. Some of the key ones that I will say that we are involved in the sector is really into it as well is the SHIFT research project that is led by Professor Lorna Wells here in University of Calgary. And that was first about finding the root causes of domestic violences, and that included specifically the cultural pieces as well. And now that SHIFT projects has moved forward in terms of engaging men in violence prevention as a learning collaborative as a sector. So which our agency has been also a vital part of that by engaging directly with the project as a participant. And then we also have been leading the up until now, we have been leading the Ethnocultural Diverse Committee of the CDVC that I mentioned earlier to really, and there is a research component to that as well, to identify the inequities within the sector as well, like to reduce the barriers and increase the safety of the marginalized women and GBV when it came to accessing supports and services around that. So as you can see, the community-based advocacy and survivor-led work that is already underway, and now we will see the next speakers talk about the unique challenges and tensions that impact the work.
Thank you so much, Rekha. It's so great to hear about all of that really great work. And I think what I love about hearing when you speak about it is we're seeing this kind of timeline. We're seeing a way of really capturing the way that the programming has evolved and developed. And so that's really helpful, and it's a great way to start. And I think now, Nahid or Maytal, if you want to take over, we're going to invite our speakers to participate now to share about some of the advocacy work that's underway and some of the advocacy work that's being practiced in Edmonton.
Yes, so I'm going to read the first question. We have 3 questions for our speakers today, and Amrita will be the first one to answer afterwards. And after Amrita, I will read it again and Tigist will answer. So the first question is, what are the ways in which you practice community-based advocacy work to address GBV against NSRI women in Edmonton? And what makes this type of work and approach unique to addressing GBV against NSRI women in Edmonton? Amrita.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this very interesting question. Very pleased to be here and to see so many colleagues from Edmonton around the table. So the term advocacy, as you mentioned before, has been somewhat traditionally problematic for funders and policymakers. They see it as a loaded term. I don't have any such problems. I define advocacy as evidence-based recommendations, research-based policy recommendations. That's how I position my work. All research-based recommendations are advocacy in and of their very nature. That said, we were formally allowed to do advocacy work only starting in around 2015, although I think we have been doing it for much longer than that. So the ways in which my organization and our partners, I will say, some of whom are around the table, have been practicing such work is through collaborative work, federally funded by, it has most often been funded by Status of Women Canada, now they're called WAGE, and also by the New Horizons program, which is ESDC. And the work has primarily been focused on understanding certain complex forms of violence, family violence, extended family violence, and community-based violence against women of variable status. I do not terribly like the term NSRI because no term is perfect. I feel this term is somewhat exclusionary and starts with a negative. Now, I'll give an example of the kind of work. So in 2015, we started a project that was focused on so-called honor-based violence. And of course, I immediately faced pushback from the community the moment I started opening my mouth to speak about it. Going deeper into the topic, I found that in the entire focus on femicidal violence, there was no focus on LGBTQ violence and the patriarchal mindset that goes into committing such violence. There was no focus on extended family violence, which is so evident across ethnicities, across different cultural groups. The entire focus was on honor killings, which were associated with people who look like me, basically. And I'm not going to put too fine a point on that. And we also found out that the tools that were in use for risk assessment focused on intimate partner violence. There was absolutely no focus on what happens when the violence is transnational. What happens when it involves members who are not intimate partners? The very tools and the questions that were being used were completely from an individualistic West-centric viewpoint. So we kind of started with a question of what's honor-based violence and what do we do about it, and extended and deepened understandings of violence and what it looks like based on evidence. So the evidence came from interviews and focus groups conducted across the entire spectrum of anti-violence service in Edmonton, speaking to, 40 plus service providers. This was back in the day, 2015. And we had something like 60 odd focus group people. We came up with certain tools and referral protocols that we shared across the agencies who were partnered and collaborating with us during that project. An interesting offshoot of that work was the realization that, of course, many women will never ever go and seek services at service desks. They're isolated for a variety of reasons. COVID is only the latest isolator to arrive at our doorsteps. Previously, it was language, right? That was the biggest one. Just the sheer fear of approaching a service desk to speak about something that you can barely speak to for yourself. I mean, you can barely frame it in your own head. How are you going to tell someone else about it? So a little thing that came out of that project was home visitation. So home visitation has been structured as a perinatal service in this province. And we knew from the evidence that women in the perinatal years are extremely susceptible to violence. So we took that little kernel of an idea and converted it into the next project, which was home visitation as a method of early intervention or early prevention, if you will, against gender-based violence. So the advocacy work that we've been doing is not traditional advocacy and stand on a soapbox at a street corner and yell, but evidence-based research work turned into policy and turned into pilot projects and referral protocols, turned into education and training. Does that answer the question?
I think it answered very well, Amrita, and thank you for putting advocacy in the right context and giving this great example of the work.
Thank you.
I'm going to address now Tigist with the same questions. So Tigist, what are the ways in which you practice community-based advocacy work to address gender-based violence against NSRI women in Edmonton? And what makes this type of work and approach unique to addressing gender-based violence against NSRI women in Edmonton?
Hi, everybody. I am from the Multicultural Health Workers Office, and we are a health workers co-op. And so our work is such that we honor families where they are at and meet them where they are at and support them to really understand where they live and navigate the system. That being said, much of my work has always been frontline, as well as supporting my team as well. We are co-op, so which means we are flat organization, and so our bosses are our clients. So in doing so, we try our best to support them in what they want to see happen. And we do believe much of the women that we support and family as a whole knows what they want. It's just that a matter of how it is that they are able to go and be able to explore that. And so in respect to family violence, we are working with the community as well as with religion leaders, as well as with the system, such as police, as well as children's services and so forth. That being said, our job is to be in the middle to try to bring both sides in what they want to see happen. And many times when we are involved to support the family will tell us that this is what I want. Many times the family are not as open as they would like to be to access the system. And we know why, because our system is punitive. And so when you are coming from the culture we come from, that kind of punitive process is not easy, because as Amrita was talking, you're not only married to him, you're married to the whole family. So there's consequences if you are stepping out of the way to try to access the system, and pretty much giving everything that's happening to you, and not also thinking what will come after that to you and your family, not only in Canada, but overseas as well. So that being said, we try to do much of our work is to really slow the system, if we can, to try to give a better way of explaining to the family what needs to happen, as well as how to look at a safety plan. Safety plan, of course, we do use the universal safety plan. However, we are working with families as well as the whole extended family. So what does a safety plan look like is what we talk about. Many times our families that we support don't understand the EPO, Emergency Protection Order, and other things that are placed in system. So we really have to be practical. For some, of course, we have to use that. It's necessary, and we would support them in acquiring that. But for many, they find that to be very difficult to live day to day on their own, when they cannot navigate the language, when they don't have transportation, when they're living quite far from their own community. There are really practical situations that really affect them, in which then luckily how we work is, and you'll actually be talking to my colleague Joy, she's also a psychologist. We do have a psychologist as well as male colleagues to be able to negotiate and work with the perpetrators, be it much of them are a man, but we also do have some time because of immigration situation, women. And so we try to look at holistically if we could support the family, be it through the psychologist where the perpetrator needed some help, if the family identified that there has been trauma. And so we do have a good holistic support circling us, as well as circling the family, to make sure that they get the kind of support they need. However, having worked in the system as well as with our community, what I find we try to push the victim to make the decision in a way that, you know, the system needs to, in a sense, like she have to hire a lawyer, she have to go to the court. Yeah, you know, there's a lot of timeline put and pressure put in the victim. and as well as expectation that she's able to survive on her own without the support. You could support her financially, but you cannot support her emotionally to have to make that decision right away. So the time is what is really essence for the kind of work we do with women that have actually have gone through trauma as well as violence, to really make that kind of decision right away, now. Whereas what we try to do is slow the system, give the woman the space and the time she needs to think about what would look like for her to live in a very healthy and good environment that she feels is right for her and her family. And in doing that, we also have translated much of the EPO, what it means in a language that they understand, as well as what's healthy family, what does a healthy family look like for them and for the family. And also, luckily, we do have some male colleagues, as I said. They are also helping the male to be able to understand and reflect on what would look like for him to go back with her if that's what they both want, and what is expected of him to accomplish through the system as well as through the work we do to really lead and be a healthy person he is. And when we have done that in a time that is needed for the whole family, which is from the Edmonton prosecutor that we invited when we had a gathering, what she said was that it's 99.8. We know even a Canadian born women who, will have 8 to 10 times going back with her partner before she makes the right decision. If that's what the case is, you can imagine, then what would that look like for immigrant women who is carrying much of the responsibility of the extended family and the family, and has a stake somehow overseas as well, if this was an arranged marriage or a marriage that actually has been put in by the whole clan. And so that being said, we know for fact, taking the time we need to make sure that they can lead us and have that mindset that they can be able to see what they could, that what good can come out of that will be the best than really kind of rushing them to make that decision. So for us, much of our work is to really, how can we slow it down so then all the parties are able to get the time that they need to reflect on what they want to see happen. So the honor is on the women, mostly, of course, as I said, much of the victims are women that we deal with, and therefore we try as much as possible to honor what it is that they would like to see come out of the situation. And that is what we feel is, to me, honorable, as well as respecting, where they're at, and, not to forget that we cannot be in trying to help her. You cannot be showing her power over to make decision, do this, do that, is what we find that without knowing the system does. And many of the women would not even come out to tell them what they need to know to even protect them. So I will pretty much stop here, and that's how, and Joy can add more to what I say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tigist, for explaining us and like emphasizing how important it is to work with the pace of the client while navigating all those like complex systems. We'll probably hear more about it in the next question. So the same question is for Joy now. And Joy, it's the same question. What are ways in which you practice community-based advocacy work to address gender-based violence against Nsri women in Edmonton? And what makes this type of work and approach unique to addressing gender-based violence against non-status refugee immigrant women in Edmonton?
Thank you so much for having me here. I, Tigist beautifully explained really the critical role that the brokers play at the co-op, and the unique embeddedness that they have within all the different communities that they serve. I think one of the most interesting, just to further some of Tigist's points, is that many of what we would say, I guess, programming that comes through the co-op is very unique to each family because of, I think, lots of efforts that aim to contextualize the situation for each family. And I think that's a big piece, is that one size doesn't fit all, which makes the work much more complicated, which makes it, I think, more time consuming. But because we're kind of afforded that ability to work at the client's pace, we are able to navigate what makes most sense to the clients. And I think Rekha pointed this out, that the importance of having the women have a voice in giving them advocacy, or to giving them that space to advocate for what resources and supports are meaningful, which often includes the well-being of the family as a whole. We also, I think, we're really shifting in our practice in the sense that we're starting to look at the ideas of resilience from a less Western, I don't know if it's so much Western, but a less individual perspective, and looking at it from understanding that levels of risk or levels of exposure to risk or trauma will actually have a differential impact on the resources, or how resources are experienced for individuals. And so that is based on Michael Unger's work from Dalhousie. So we're really kind of looking at that resilience piece, because we also know that the work has to include contextualizing the role of poverty, racism, as well as trauma that often affects women and the families, as well as the men and the partners. So I think there's, I'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the other questions about, I think that would impact some of the barriers. But I think that we work really hard, I think, as an organization to collaborate and to work side by side with each other. So as Tigist says, we are a flat organization, which we, I think, then practice that piece of honoring each other's wealth of knowledge and experience, because we all come from these communities that we're serving. And so we have an opportunity to really glean kind of from like inside experts about what makes sense most for all the clients that we serve. So I think that's unique in terms of what I've, I think, experienced here in Edmonton in terms of organizations, is because we also advocate for the changing of programming within other maybe services or systems that that we feel would best fit for the family we're serving at the time. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. And then Nahid is going to ask the next question.
So our next question focuses on the challenges in doing community-based advocacy work. And each of you brings a unique perspective as leaders, researchers, and service providers. So my question is first to Tigist. And Tigist, based on your experience, what are some of the challenges that in doing community-based advocacy work you face?
The challenges. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, much of the challenges to really, like I said, for the system to be able to give us the time to be able to handle it in a way that the client needs time, right? You're always pressured for, the family that you're supporting, that there's timeline in what we do and when we deal with the system. And therefore, sometimes that is very hard for much of the women that we support, because even for us, what we believe in every work we do, we have to have relationship. Without relationship, you can't really make a difference. And doing so, we can do superficial relationship to get to the bottom of what is happening, so then we could actually find the cure for it. And so much of the time is the pressure that we get by the system for the family to make decisions, like for women to make decisions, to do this, to do that, is what's actually hinders our a job to be able to help them in a way that they need help with. Because you have to understand, as I said, when you are dealing with family violence, you do need to have that time. So many times, coming from where we come from, you want to get away from abuser for you to think and have the time that you need to be able to reflect and figure out and connect with the right people even before they talk to us. Which means they may have to call overseas to be able to connect with the people who give them the advice they need and the plan that they need to put in place. Because you and I are trying to support this particular person. However, there are, for example, these women have a responsibility of, maybe he's the one who's sending money to her family. As Joy was saying, poverty is huge. And so she may not be working because she has several children at home and working, of course, unpaid work at home, and doing what she can do to provide for the family, in hoping that he's also going to send support to her family to be able to make them survive. And also maybe they were sponsoring her family members to come to Canada. So that's pending if you compromise leaving him for forever. However, what she probably need is to try to figure out, to bring the right people to actually tell him this is unacceptable and I'm not gonna do this or continue with this if you are continuing this abuse. And so our job is to really figure out how supportive can we be? How can we help her? What is hindering her from making the decision she wants to make? Those are things that we need to do that. It's not a 2-hour discussion. It's not 21 days discussion. It could mean a whole lot. So the kind of support we give, I find sometimes for some of the women is pretty superficial. And so therefore they go with it, but at the end, because of the pressure that they're getting from the system, they end up going back faster than we would like them to. So that is much of the kind of challenge that we see in the system when we are working with the family.
Thank you, Tejas, for talking about all these challenges when you're working with these vulnerable communities. So the next person I will ask is Joy. So Joy, based on your experience, what are some of the challenges in doing community-based advocacy work?
Again, I think, what Tejas was talking about, right? There's like a lot of hidden things, maybe call it secrets, that are really never shared, right? Due to fear of consequences to self, to other members, and you know, to extended family. So that makes it difficult, and requires, you know, the ability for women to establish that really needed trusting relationship. There's also those community pressures that are inherent, and although we know community is a huge part of a strength, it can also be a reason why, you know, they wouldn't want to lose that support network. And it's also, I think, really important for us to start understanding what we mean when we talk about collective healing. We have to ask who's defining that, and whether the right people are defining that for the services that are being provided. I think increasing safety is really difficult when women or the perpetrators don't have a place to go. I think it's much more difficult to implement, especially many women that we work with often are afraid to go to shelter, are unfamiliar with it. So it becomes increasingly difficult to provide safety plans that, you know, your typical safety plans, without really having coordination with other, you know, formal systems. I think, you know, I think it's the shifts, right? The required shifts that we ask people to make in their cultural paradigms, and if level of acculturation, or whatever we want to call it, integration, is low, that's like a really difficult thing for people to grasp, that what they've known to be, you know, inherent in who they are is not okay here in Canada. It's a difficult thing, I think, to process. And I've talked already about the overlay of poverty, racism, and trauma. And I think this is one of the things we're trying to address, is to maybe look at contextualizing the resources needed from a more external sources of support. We've been using what's called the ADAPT psychosocial model, which is Dr. Sophie Yohanni's work from the U of A, and it's adaptation and development after trauma and persecution. And she modified this from Silove's work. But basically it's looking at how like identity, meaning, justice, safety, and attachment, they've been identified as pillars of psychosocial well-being. And I would say that a barrier is we haven't yet, I think, meaningfully addressed how to help those who live in, you know, bicultural worlds, or who migrate here and have to navigate all these different transitions. We haven't really meaningfully understood, or I guess we're just getting there in some ways, to figure out how to strengthen these pillars that we know are, or we're assuming, you know, really provide those pillars of psychosocial health. So, thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for providing your insight and sharing your experience of these challenges. So the question is now to Amrita, that based on your experience, what are some of the challenges doing community-based advocacy work?
Dollars. I'm going to start talking about dollars now. So what do I mean by that? Funding has profound implications for relationships. So there's client service provider contact, that's one thing, but it's also the relationships we need to build around the table. So my ability to sit here right now is dependent a lot on my salary dollars, right? Which could be cut depending on what the funder has to say tomorrow. Dollars are important to make available the time for building trust and rapport. So even a brief gap between funding flows could mean layoffs. So that's damaging to staff and clients. It's damaging also to people such as myself who do participatory action research and community development, building collaborations and all of that. So when you have a layoff, what that means is that somebody has to be rehired, and that means the client has to re-engage with someone new. So what that means is also service interruptions, clients being turned away, put on hold. And you know what happens as a result. Client attrition, people drop out of programs, which means it's really bad news for your report cards to the funder. And that's how the cycle goes. Relationships and dollars are always connected. And unfortunately for us, relationships are being monetized. So what that also means is that when you have to talk about something as difficult as violence or trauma, you need additional time, like Tegas just described so beautifully. But do you have the time? I know that Multicultural Health Brokers has a long-standing, rich and proud history of making available their time regardless of the money they have. All of us do that, I think. But at the end of the day, these things are monetized. When you have a situation of limited funding, the amount of time you have for individual client visits or time to spend and connect with partner agencies becomes reduced in number. So we might have an ethical duty to care. So we, do the go over, above and beyond, and we do things outside, before, during, lunch hours, whatever. We are setting ourselves up for burnout because of the pressures of dollars that the system is imposing upon us. And that's another challenge. We don't talk about vicarious trauma. Oh yes, we do talk about vicarious trauma, but we don't talk about vicarious trauma for immigrant service providers. We don't talk about vicarious trauma for people who themselves have been through their own traumas of migration and now are servicing other traumatized people. I was recently at a presentation on vicarious trauma, and the thing that astonished me the most about it was the absolute erasure of the experiences of migrant service providers. So these are the challenges that I see. I could go on for the entire day, but I think that's my rant for now.
Thank you, Amrita, for providing us information about the multi-layered challenges.
Thank you.
And I would like to invite Nera, if you can take over from here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm Rita. So to just talk about money, today I'm going to talk about, the other big elephant in the room. And let's center again on COVID-19. That's the other elephant in the room. So what happened with COVID-19 and gender-based violence, and how those two intersect? We need to understand that this crisis was a crisis already for gender-based violence survivors. The implications of COVID-19 are really apparent. In Canada, COVID-19 is revealing an architecture of inequality, and those who were already unprotected before the pandemic are impacted differently today. COVID-19 has opened the window for necessary political and social change. It was revealed at our last roundtable the need to hear from non-status refugee and immigrant women, their experiences and participation in policy and solutions, and meaningful involvement and collaboration. Let's bring, sorry, I'm gonna just pass it back to you guys to continue the conversation.
So are we going to this? I'm sorry, I think I must have lost track of our, we're going to the third question now, or?
Sorry, I think we need to invite Monica now. My bad, guys. So to talk a little bit more about COVID-19 and the effects on non-status refugee and immigrant women of this crisis and the crisis who was previously here, I want to invite Monica, who was a participant of our focus group last year when we did the consultation. And Monica is going to tell us a little bit about her experience on navigating and surviving this crisis and the multiple crises that non-status refugee and immigrant women have been facing lately. Monica?
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica.
Hi, my name is Monica, and I'm originally from Mexico, but I have been established in Edmonton, Alberta for a few years now. My ex-husband and father of my child is a Canadian born citizen, but even though we were legally married for almost 10 years, he never sponsored me to become a permanent resident. I am a survivor of domestic violence, and together with my daughter, we have been living in different shelters for almost 5 years. It might sound contradictory, but I consider myself to be lucky because by the time that the pandemic started and the stay-at-home order was mandatory, I was already into the system, so I could navigate into the same and access to some forms of support. I know by firsthand that many associations and organizations cannot offer any longer any time of service to people who don't have any status in Canada because they don't get any kind of funding and they have implemented new guidelines in the last few years. I remember that we were on a spring break from my daughter's school when we found out about the new normal, and we had to start to deal with the online school. I felt scared. I felt alone. I felt anxious. Sorry. But there was nothing, or at least not so much that I could do. I don't have any family in Canada, and I only have a few friends, and I was already isolated during my marriage, so now we were even more. Because we have valid IDs, we could access to the food bank, but still it was very hard to do it because I don't drive. So I would have to take the bus, but it was very complicated. Or I could have gone on a taxi cab, but I could not afford it. Well, what really helped was that I was very involved in my daughter's school. Sorry. What really helped me was that I was involved in my daughter's school, and we were part of the program for E4C and Big Brothers Big Sisters clubs, and they were delivering us food hampers at least once every month. My main source of income was the child support that I was receiving at the time. It was only $698 every month. From there, I had to pay rent, I had to buy my bus pass, I had to pay for my phone bill, buy groceries, and pretty much survive. Even when I had a visitor's visa and my application on the humanitarian and compassionate grounds was in process, I still have no status for the government of Alberta or Canada. I was invisible and I did not exist. I could not access or apply. There were more questions than answers. I was trying to buy groceries with an already limited budget, and on top of that, PPE. If I was lucky to find any products left at the store, I could afford to pay for most of them because the prices were higher than normal, and I felt like they were just taking advantage of the situation. We were lucky enough because we were already living in a second stage shelter, so we have a safe place where to live and some form of steady income. The shelter started providing free connection to the internet and lend Chromebooks so the kids could attend the online school. But I think it would have helped a lot too if they waive or reduce the rent fee during that time. I was very afraid what would happen if my daughter got sick, but I still could take her to the hospital. But what was even more worried about, what if I got infected? I didn't have any medical coverage. What if I have to go to the hospital? Who will take care of my kid? What if I die? She will have to go to live with her dad. Could my family still fight for her custody or have access to her? What if I survive? How much and for how long will I have to pay to the bill from the hospital? I already have enough debt with legal aid from my legal proceedings. What if the disease leaves me with permanent side effects on me? I was afraid of getting sick, but I was more terrified of what would happen if I got sick. Finally, in the middle of the pandemic, I was approved for my permanent residency, but I haven't been able to finish with the process because many offices are still closed. I am now on income support and I'm really thankful for that, but yet it's not enough. I still don't receive the Canada Child Benefit. I applied already, but it can take up to 11 weeks before you get approved. I'm a permanent resident now, but I have been, and I still am, a victim of racism and discrimination. Before, I was an immigrant with no status who should go back to her country, according to some people. Now, I am legal resident, but still marked as a foreign woman who wants to live from the government because I want to go back to school and access to financial funding and scholarships. My English is not perfect, but I can understand it and I can speak for myself. Also, I rarely take a no for an answer, but I personally know people, especially women, who have language barriers, lack of status, or simply low self-esteem. And I can only imagine how they feel and all of the struggle they have to go through, especially during the pandemic. First, we were victims of my ex-husband. Later, we were victims of the system. This was already a crisis and sadly continues to be a crisis. When people in the government marginalize and discriminate against immigrant women, they are doing it to our children as well, even when some of them are Canadian citizens. So whatever we suffer from or lack of, they do it as well. They don't realize that they are denying their rights as citizens and as human beings. There is still a lot of work to do, but I truly believe and hope that we can do it together. I just want to finish with something that I heard some time ago. Do not ask what world we will leave to our children. The question is, which kind of children we will leave to this world? Thank you.
Monica, thank you so much for your words. Thank you so much for your insight and sharing your experience with us and sharing about, what the whole status means and how that can access you places and take you places of closed doors in crucial times like this one of COVID-19. And even before that, when we were talking about the previous crisis that we were facing. Thank you so much, Monica, for sharing your challenges and your experiences and the opportunities that you have had. Thank you so much. I'm gonna pass it now to Maytal and Nahid so they can, introduce us to the next set of questions.
Thank you, Monica and Nira. Yes, we are now going to ask the speakers our third and last question. And then Margarita will share some resources for us at the end. I just want to ask our speakers to speak more briefly because we're a little bit late for our schedule. So the first speaker who is going to answer is Joy. And Joy, the third question is, just like Monica shared with us, this context of COVID-19, why is the work of community advocacy and centering NSRI women's experience and their particular vulnerabilities is especially critical at this time?
Thank you. And thank you, Monica, so much for sharing your story. I think you really shared so much of the complicating factors that really force us to think about addressing how we are to be of service to people who are also in your situation. So I think in the context of COVID-19, as we know, we are in a greater economic crisis than I think they say it's greater than the 1930s depression. So financial strain, unemployment is an ultimate high. And we know from research that's linked to higher incidences of gender-based violence, and because of already the precarious situation status, maybe sometimes the loss of rural, the loss of positions and credentials in the transitions, many different kinds of insecurities, like such as food, and also because most of the women are based in poverty. We often will see there's higher incidences now, higher cases, higher client inquiries, the move to online learning supports, but also the move of employment into online virtual it's less visible. So there's less, there might be a tendency to feel that there's just less ability to reach out for support. So I think that has become one of the main issues that we worry about with helping our clients.
Thank you, Joy. And Amrita, I'm going to ask you the same question. In the context of COVID-19, why is the work of community advocacy and centering NSRI women's experiences with particular vulnerability is especially critical at this time, from your perspective?
I think Joy already answered this question very effectively in many regards. I will just bring up some supplementary points, if I may. I have been at webinars recently which spoke a lot about virtual interventions and the value of virtual interventions. Something that is very, very easy to look past, unfortunately, in a highly developed setting such as Canada, is that the digital divide is very, very real. And I fear that the pandemic is going to valorize digital technologies of communication and networking and seeking help to the detriment of people who may not have, it's not just may not have the calling plans or the data plans or the call minutes or the access to signals or whatever, but they just may desperately need that in-person support because they're already dealing with the after effects of isolation. And all of these aspects, I think, are falling by the wayside. Yesterday, I was at a discussion. It was a confidential conversation, but there was something in it that really hit me in the solar plexus. And this was a person who is self-identifies as Indigenous and for whom the current system of social distancing and the loss of ceremony and the loss of togetherness reminds her of residential school. So we have to think about what that means. There's a lot of people out there who are hurting, really hurting, because healing from historical trauma has been redoubled in the current context. But we don't think enough about these things because it doesn't seem as important, but it is very important. I know this does not speak to the question of non-status refugee and immigrant women, but that's not the point. The point is it is equally relevant for them. I've been at other gatherings where focus groups where a coffee ceremony would be extremely important, a multi-generational coffee ceremony. Well, where is that now in the current situation? Gone. I am working on a project in home visitation. How are you going to do a home visit now? So well, it's still possible. People are finding ways to achieve these things, but the voices of people who already were being silenced by dominant discourses are even being more silenced now, thanks to social distancing and the widening of a digital divide. For this reason, I believe that our work is even more critical. Sorry, I don't have any solutions. I don't think too many people do. And the ones who do, I think they don't speak enough about how ineffective those answers are. But that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Amrita. And I'm going to call Tigis to answer it. Tigis, can you please answer about how this work is important in the context of COVID-19, specifically this intersection of work that you do with NSRI women who experience violence?
Yeah, Joy and Amrita have already expressed how difficult it is now, even before when you are seeing family or women face to face has been even as much harder to really support them in a way that's timely and respectfully accept where they're at, and using, like Joy was talking, the model that we are taught to really understand trauma and what that look like, and that's touching, that hugging when women are telling you from the heart what they have gone through, the time that it takes to be able to express and be able to take. Now, virtue is very, very difficult. And in fact, the kind of work we do, we have a support group for women that was being there for the past 10 years, which has brought women and talk about many different issues, in particular health as a whole, and self-care and all the things that they enjoy about ritual and things like that. Nowadays, much of the women are isolated, and isolation is even already an issue for many of the women before the COVID, but now it's even real. And when we were actually bringing women together, we had to provide childcare. We had to provide everything that was possible, transportation and so forth, to even bring them here and be able to have the time that they need for 2.5 hours and so forth. When you have multiple children and you can't even leave home, and you are scared of the COVID, and not able to speak on the phone the way you would like to, and not meet other women and have that support in place, which is it goes a long way for us. In fact, those who have been part of that group were able to count on that, because they would call each other and talk to each other, laugh with each other, even have the ceremony as they're all having their coffee at home, but kind of joke with each other. But those who are new and are going through that, which is unfortunate, we have had many of them, they're basically on their own and are suffering. So it is a very difficult time, and we're trying our best to protect ourselves and the client, and not to meet physically. There are times we have to do what we have to do to be able to support women. And so that's all I can say to you, because some things are easy said and done, but we know the little support you could show and support women, the more that they can be able to see the future and the future of their children being brighter. So we are, as much as possible, we're trying our best, but the virtue did not help us at all. It's very tough. So that's all I can say to you.
Thank you, Tigist. Amrita, did you want to comment?
Yes, I was just building on just the final point. I noticed that you had a sub-question on particular vulnerabilities. I'm sorry, I didn't notice it earlier. Right now there's not enough time, but we need to speak at some future date perhaps about the vulnerabilities of senior people, of diverse ethnicity, if I may say so, location, whether rural or urban. These are factors that have a really critical impact on vulnerability and access to supports and services. The digital divide impacts seniors especially. It's socially unfamiliar to many. It's technologically frightening to many. I know my father, who lives in India, is terrified of using the computer and the cell phone. Oddly enough, my mom learned faster than he did. It's not very different over here. And this is something that we need to consider. And I feel that digital divide is extremely ageist in its impact, and we should look at that. Based on research in the rural settings, it's very evident that the vulnerability is there that existed even before COVID will only be deepened afterwards. And we still don't know what that's going to look like. We may not know for 2 to 3 years down the line what those vulnerabilities will look like until the pandemic has abated enough for people to get out there and have those conversations in the first place. That was all I had to add.
Actually, I'm sorry, can I say something I forgot? Would it be possible?
Yes.
Actually, like I said before, we do have psychologists as well as male colleagues that have been working with us. And so what we have been able to do was when women are refusing to access the mainstream services due to the violence, we were able to bring in people that the male partner respects and understands, and was able to bring in more safety plan in place to get him out, but furthermore to really find a place for him. And then our colleagues would work closely with him in understanding and looking at the issue that's in hand. Sometimes we have to also involve the police and of course the mainstream. And also what that told us was that we cannot do this alone, especially within the multicultural health workers. We do a lot, and communities actually, like I said, the women that we were supporting that used to come here are the ones who are referring because they're friends and family members and so forth. So we're getting a lot of informal referral within our communities. So what ended up happening was we knew that we had to educate and find more allies within the communities that we work with. So we started doing some workshop with religion leaders, very often community leaders, that some of this men will go seek and respect, as well as some women within the community that could be able to balance the gender aspect of it. And so we are at least succeeding in that, because we are not alone and we're not able to help the many issues that is coming towards us. So that has been one of the light under the tunnel for us, but there has to be more work done to really educate the community, the children, and all other aspects of the families surrounding, in order to talk about that violence is not acceptable, and therefore you cannot expect the women to put up and stay home and run the family. But we need the religious leader, the leaders in the community, to step in and be allied with us and be educating the family, as well as in the religion areas, to really talk about healthy family. So that has been the one thing that we are very much proactive to try to do. So that has been supportive for our community.
All right, thank you, everybody. Amrita, I see you have another comment. Go for it.
Final one. We haven't even, okay, not easy. We haven't spoken about racism and what that has done to community relationships and to people. We haven't spoken about what that has meant for women who may have been undergoing violence at home, violence from landlords and from employers, and racism at the same time. And what has all of this social distancing and digital divide and digital communication meant for the community activities that were trying to achieve something anti-racist? That's a topic for a whole other conference, I think. But it's something that's so vast and so ugly, I think people don't even want to really look too hard at it. But it's happening. We know it's happening. That was my, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Amrita, and thank you to everybody who's participated in this conversation. I think just to follow up a little bit on what, Amrita, you just mentioned as well, I think that what I'm hearing as well from the conversation is how much the violence that we're referring to is structural, that it's gendered, racialized, and we have so much different language depending our perspectives, depending, the spaces that we're operating in. but it becomes so clear that we are thinking about this in an intersectional way, that we are, that we are thinking about these issues in a way that it's not just about the violence that's being experienced, but also we're thinking about housing, we're thinking about we're thinking about so many different systems, and as Monica said in her, part as well, victims of multiple systems and intersecting systems that are happening. I think what's really important is, and I heard this mentioned by many of the speakers as well, was the importance of these relationships, the opportunity to build these relationships, the opportunity to have these conversations. And sometimes we're focused on the deliverables, or we're focused on numbers, or we're focused on something that's some sort of tangible product, and not always have the opportunity to be focused on the processes and the relationships, and just having a space for some of this conversation that can be quite messy as well, because as Amrita said earlier as well, we don't always, it's not about necessarily coming up and closing this roundtable with a solution. I think what I wanted to also kind of go back to was this piece about advocacy in particular, and hearing from everyone from the different perspectives in terms of their practice, their interpretation, and also definition of the way they work with advocacy. The language around brokers I thought was really helpful as well, and that's part of the name of the organization, but all of that kind of work that's happening, and the importance of the relationships ultimately. It is difficult for this work to be done when we can't be meeting in person, or for services to be available when there isn't necessarily a neutral drop-in space for women to also go to. Something that Nira shared earlier with our conversations with non-status refugee immigrant women was just having a space that doesn't have to be about recounting pain, doesn't have to be about a certain kind of program, but just to drop in a neutral type of space as well, where someone can have a cup of coffee, where someone can decide, would I like to get involved or learn more? It's about that operating at the speed of trust, as we heard in our travels as well, and in meeting with different people and service providers. So this is an opportunity, I think, right now where these discussions, the ideas that we're having them across different regions, we want to be able to narrate kind of some shared issues that we're hearing in the regions, but also be able to contextualize, as Joy mentioned, and Tigist as well, to kind of contextualize and talk about some of the local needs, and what kind of work we can do if we're thinking about this as well at a national level, right? So where we are able to identify some shared issues, some shared challenges that can kind of also become priorities for our work in addressing gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women. I don't have my eye right now on the chat. I'm not sure if we had any questions come in. No questions right now, that's fine. I wanna share a few of the resources and ways in which people can stay involved in our efforts. Again, as I mentioned, this project is 5 years in duration. Right now we finished year 1, we're in the 2nd year. So the implementation of the project means that we are going to be growing our network with community, community members, advocates, service providers, non-status refugee immigrant women. We want to invite you to be a part of these networks, which again, they have a focus on what's happening locally, so across the different regions that we're working in, but also an opportunity to be collaborating and communicating with folks at the national level. And I think that that's something unique and important for us to be working towards. Nira is going to share right now a mailing list, which is, please fill it out. It's a form that allows you to identify, your interest, maybe your organization, background, community, and that way we can keep you connected to our project efforts. We still have 2 more roundtables that are going to be taking place. We have one for Vancouver, focused on Vancouver on Thursday, September 24th. 2 to 4 Eastern time, and then on Thursday, October 1st, focused on Fredericton. The same link that you use to register for us is also the one that you will be able to register and be able to attend the upcoming roundtables. The goal at the end of this roundtable series, we will have a narration, a report of what we heard, as I mentioned, and we are coming together we're still securing the date, but we'll be coming together to host a conference, so a national conversation that brings together these ideas and allows us to continue to brainstorm together. So bringing life to these ideas in conversation and in collaboration. So if you sign up for the mailing list, you will be able to hear about all of the updates, and you'll hear about the dates once those are secured. I also just want to share, one moment. I also want to share a link for a survey that is being distributed, and this is a survey that's focused on Alberta. Let's see here. So if Nira, you want to share the, here it is. It's, we just invite you to also participate in this survey, which is called Understanding Newcomer Experiences of Inclusion. It's part of a 2-year community-based research project conducted by the Center for Race and Culture. This project seeks to examine newcomers' experiences of settlement, integration, and inclusion, and how these impact newcomer well-being. The intent is to find solutions to challenges faced by newcomers to Canada regarding settlement and integration. So it sounds like the survey, they're going to be collecting data up until September 2020. So we invite you to also participate, and the survey is available in different languages. All right, so, and I think that the mailing list was shared, and we also were able to share the survey. We also had a report that Amrita shared with us as well. We'll make sure to include that in the chat, the link to, so that people can view that report. I don't know if Amrita, you want to just maybe briefly share what the report is about? Okay. It's a lot, I know, but
I'm not muted. So if you go to that website, please be warned, the report is very long. There's also a summary, which is 5 pages, so you can choose. It's based on something that happened pre-COVID. Hopefully, we will return to some kind of normal again sometime. It's based on conversations with approximately 43 service providers, interviews about 90 minutes each, and focus groups held with 80 participants across the length and breadth of Alberta, rural and urban locations. The purpose of it was to find out whether home visitation can be made an effective vehicle for family violence supports to women in their homes instead of expecting them to come to service desks. We are not reinventing the wheel here. There's already a platform and an infrastructure for home visitation and family violence screening in the province. Our effort was to create enhancements to understand the experiences of women of diverse migrant status, I'll say that, and to understand the experiences of Indigenous women as well. Why these two populations? Because home visitation, wonderful as it may sound, has the clause of mandatory reporting of violence attached with it, which means that if the home visitor sees something that's of violence in the home and there's a child in the home, she is mandated to report it to Children's Services, which automatically means people are likely to be very scared of home visitation. So we wanted to find out, is there a way to make this work? Is there a way to talk to people about home visitation, to create supports, to make the process of mandatory reporting not so terrifying? Because this is very promising, home visitation as a support against violence, but this is the biggest barrier. And our project is trying to find solutions and get around that barrier somehow. There's a 5-page summary. If you look at it, you will find the rundown of what it's about. I think that's pretty much what it's about.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And also, I just want to invite Rekha. I noticed Rekha would like to add a final comment as well. So Rekha,
yeah,
wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. I think I really myself have learned a lot, and one thing I felt was touched upon, but is very critical in terms of the COVID related challenges, was specifically working with the immigrant population that we have been serving, is the safety assessment virtually, and having that real safety assessment and real safety planning. And I say that from some of the experiences we have had in the COVID is, say, for instance, we got an email from a client, and then it seemed, the language seemed a bit off. So it was very much clear to us eventually that this was actually not the client emailing, but it's the spouse who has the access to the phone, the computer, and everything. So the digital control is one thing that is very much, we have seen a few times within the COVID. And when we are assessing the safety, and many immigrant families live in a joint family setting, so they may have in-laws and other family members around, and when you're providing that virtual support, counseling, or whatever it is, how do we know that there is no one else around? And this could happen to anyone, but typically in some of the immigrant family cases where they have in-laws and others around, just wanted to kind of point that out. That is critical. We are finding in our services, so it wasn't kind of brought up, so just thought of, putting it out there. That's all.
Thank you, Amrita. Thank you, Amrita, for that. That's a good point. And the language too is important. This digital control, we heard about the digital divide. We are nearing the last few minutes of our session, so I want to take this moment right now to thank everybody for joining us today. And thank you so much to the speakers who really provided us with unique perspectives and very important kind of discussion around advocacy work and around the kind of emerging issues and also the ongoing issues, right? That we're hearing that this is not necessarily new, but further entrenched, and it's being revealed in ways that require immediate attention. So we're thankful to all of the speakers that were here today. Amrita, thank you so much. Joy, thank you so much for joining us. Tigist for joining us, and Reka as well for joining us today. And for everyone that's listening, we will be sharing the recording. You'll get a written summary, and we encourage you to share it with your networks and your communities as well. And a big thank you to Nira, Nahid, and Maytal as the co-hosts for today's session. Good job. And remember that please fill out that mailing list, because that's kind of the way that we're going to be able to stay in touch with folks who were here today and to keep you involved in our efforts as we build this network. Maytal and Nahid will be taking a lead with that role in Edmonton. So yes, we look forward to hopefully having people stay involved and stay connected to our efforts. Thanks everybody, and have a good rest of the afternoon.